You've probably seen the images, the mighty ziggurats of Mesopotamia rising from desert sands, the golden treasures of Ur, the epic saga of Gilgamesh carved into clay. We think we know ancient Sumer. We imagine scribes bent over cuneiform tablets, priests ascending temple stairs, merchants haggling in bustling markets. But what if I told you that one of Sumer's greatest cities has been hiding in plain sight for over 4,000 years, and even now, after more than a century of excavation, we still can't explain what we're finding there? Welcome to Girsu, the sacred capital of the Lagash kingdom, a place where every shovel of earth reveals another impossibility, another question that shouldn't exist. This isn't just another lost city story. This is about a civilization that achieved things we're only beginning to understand, that left behind mysteries so profound they challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. Girsu wasn't some backwater settlement. From roughly 2900 BC to 2100 BC, this was one of the most powerful urban centers in human history, home to perhaps 50,000 souls, a place where the written word was refined, where art reached heights that wouldn't be matched for millennia, where engineering projects defied the limitations of Bronze Age technology. The French started digging here in 1877, and they're still digging today. Every season brings new revelations. Massive temple complexes that shouldn't exist given the available labor force. Hydraulic systems that demonstrate knowledge of mathematics we didn't think they possessed. Artifacts that prove trade networks stretching thousands of miles in every direction. And perhaps most unsettling of all, evidence of practices and beliefs that simply don't fit our models of how early civilizations developed. You're going to walk with me through fog-shrouded excavation trenches, stand before towering mud-brick walls that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and confront questions that professional archaeologists whisper about in conference hallways but rarely publish. We're going to explore the temples where priests claimed to speak with gods who walked among mortals. We'll examine the workshops where artisans created sculptures so lifelike they seemed to breathe. We'll trace the canals that fed a population larger than most medieval European cities. And through it all, we'll ask the questions nobody wants to answer. How did they do it? What did they know? And perhaps most importantly, what happened to all that knowledge when Girsu fell? Picture this: you're standing at the base of the Ininu, the White Thunderbird House, the primary temple complex of Girsu, and your neck cranes back as you try to take in the scale of what rises before you. The foundation platform alone covers nearly 4 hectares, that's roughly 6 modern football fields, and rises 11 meters above the surrounding plain, every cubic meter representing thousands of man-hours of earth moving with nothing but reed baskets and human muscle. But here's where it gets interesting. French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzeck, who first excavated this site in the 1880s, found something nobody expected. The entire structure was built according to a precise mathematical plan that incorporated ratios and proportions that wouldn't appear in Western architecture for another 2,000 years. The main sanctuary measured exactly 60 by 30 cubits, a perfect 2-to-1 ratio that created acoustic properties modern sound engineers recognize as optimal for amplifying human voice without echo distortion. The walls weren't just thick for structural support. They averaged 4 meters at the base, tapering to 2 meters at the upper levels. They were positioned to channel wind through the interior chambers, creating a natural cooling system that kept the inner sanctum at least 10 degrees cooler than the exterior even at midday in summer. Now, conventional archaeology tells us that Gudea, the famous ruler of Lagash around 2144 to 2124 BC, built or rebuilt this temple complex, and we have his own inscriptions describing the process in devotional texts that read like construction manuals. He claims to have brought cedar beams from the mountains of Lebanon, a journey of over 800 kilometers through hostile territory. He speaks of exotic stones, diorite from Magan, modern Oman, probably quarried and shipped up the Persian Gulf, materials that had to traverse thousands of kilometers to reach this site. And here's the puzzle: we've found the stones, we've found the cedar imprints in the mud brick, we've confirmed through isotope analysis that these materials did indeed come from exactly where Gudea said they came from. But how did a city-state barely 200 square kilometers in total area marshal the resources for such undertakings? Modern estimates suggest the Ninu required at least 5 million mud bricks, each individually formed, dried, and laid. At even optimistic production rates, with ideal weather, that's a minimum of 1,500 workers laboring for 3 to 5 years, and this during a period we know was politically unstable, when Lagash was frequently at war with neighboring Umma over water rights and border disputes. French excavations between 1929 and 1931 under André Perret revealed another impossibility buried in the temple's foundations: massive drainage systems built from fired ceramic pipes, each piece precisely fitted to the next with bitumen seals, creating a waterproof network that channeled both ritual libations and seasonal rainwater away from the sacred precinct. This isn't primitive engineering. These are sophisticated hydraulic systems that demonstrate understanding of gradient, pressure, and flow rate. Chemical analysis of the bitumen shows it was mixed with specific ratios of mineral additives to increase waterproofing properties, a technology that suggests experimentation and refinement over generations. But Girsu's entire florescence as a major urban center lasted perhaps 800 years, and much of that time was consumed by conflict. Where did this knowledge come from? Why don't we see developmental stages, the trial and error you'd expect as builders figured out what worked? The artifacts recovered from the temple's interior layers only deepen the mystery. Gidea's famous diorite statues, and they've found more than 30 of them, display a level of stoneworking skill that shouldn't be possible with Bronze Age tools. Diorite ranks 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. The copper and bronze chisels available to Sumerian sculptors rank around 3.5 to 4. You quite literally cannot carve diorite effectively with bronze. Modern stone carvers who've attempted to replicate these statues using period-appropriate tools report that it's virtually impossible to achieve the fine detail, the perfect symmetry, the smooth polish visible on Gidea's portraits. Some researchers have suggested the use sand abrasion techniques, rotating the stone against bronze tools with sand as an intermediary cutting agent, but experimental archaeology trials show this method takes prohibitively long and doesn't produce the crisp edges and fine details we see on the originals. Several statues include cuneiform inscriptions carved into the diorite itself, with characters barely 2 millimeters high, each sign perfectly formed. Try carving your name into a piece of granite with a bronze chisel and you'll understand the problem. Then there's the matter of what the temple was actually for. Yes, it was dedicated to Ningirsu, the patron deity of Lagash, the divine warrior whose thunderbird symbol appears on every official seal. But recent geophysical surveys conducted by the British Museum's excavation team, they've been working the site since 2016, have revealed a complex of underground chambers beneath the main temple that nobody can explain. These aren't burial chambers or storage rooms. They're architectural spaces, some with vaulted ceilings strong enough to survive 4,000 years of overburden, connected by narrow passages that create a labyrinthine network extending at least 40 meters beyond the visible temple footprint. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there might be 3 distinct subterranean levels, though full excavation has been limited by funding and the political situation in southern Iraq. What were these chambers for? Some archaeologists propose they were treasury vaults, though no significant treasure has been found in the explored sections. Others suggest they might have been initiatory spaces for priestly rituals, a kind of ancient mystery cult temple where initiates descended into darkness for symbolic death and rebirth ceremonies. Local legend, still told by the Arab villagers who live near the ruins, speaks of passages that once connected Girsu's temples to the distant city of Uar, a network of tunnels running dozens of kilometers underground through which priests could travel unseen. Ridiculous, of course, except that we keep finding these unexplained subterranean structures. Walk through the reconstructed temple precinct in your mind. The sun beats down on whitewashed mud brick walls. Pilgrims crowd the outer courtyards, bringing offerings of barley, dates, and beer. Priests in long woolen robes move through the shadows of columned halls. Somewhere deep beneath your feet, in chambers that haven't seen daylight in 4 millennia, the stone walls hold secrets nobody has read. What rituals were performed in that darkness? What knowledge was passed from master to initiate in voices no living person has heard? Gidea's inscriptions promise that Ningirsu himself appeared to him in dreams, providing the temple's floor plan and specifications. For most scholars, that's religious poetry, metaphor for divine inspiration. But what if Gudea was recording something more literal, inherited knowledge, preserved traditions, building techniques passed down from some earlier, forgotten source? We know Sumerian kings obsessed over connecting themselves to antediluvian rulers, to the legendary kings who reigned before the flood. Their king lists cite reigns of tens of thousands of years, clearly mythical, but perhaps encoding some folk memory of greater antiquity, of knowledge that predated writing itself. Still, for all the excavation, all the analysis, all the theories, we're left grasping at shadows. The Ininu rises from the desert like a question mark in mud brick, and after 147 years of digging, we still don't know the answer. Now let's turn to one of the most disturbing and revealing artifacts ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, the Stele of the Vultures, discovered at Girsu in 1881 by de Sarzec's workers, currently residing in the Louvre, and depicting a level of organized military violence that many scholars insist shouldn't exist in a culture we're told was only just emerging from the Neolithic. This isn't a subtle document. Carved in limestone relief around 2460 BC, it stands 1.8 meters tall and depicts in brutal detail the army of Eannatum, king of Lagash, crushing the forces of neighboring Umma in a territorial dispute over the Guadina Plain, a strip of agricultural land both cities claimed. But the shock isn't that Bronze Age city-states fought over resources. Of course they did. The shock is how they fought, the level of tactical sophistication and institutional organization the stele reveals. Look at the carved images. Eannatum's infantry advances in perfect formation, locked shields overlapping in what military historians call a phalanx formation, each soldier carrying identical spears, wearing identical helmets, moving as a single unit. This is disciplined, drill-trained, professional warfare, not the chaotic warrior culture we typically associate with early Bronze Age conflict. The Greeks get credit for inventing phalanx tactics around 700 BC. This stele predates that by 17 centuries and shows Sumerian armies already employing sophisticated combined arms tactics. Behind the infantry you see chariots, not the light, spoke-wheeled chariots of later periods, but heavy, four-wheeled wagons pulled by onager teams, each carrying a driver and a spear-armed warrior. Military historians have analyzed the mechanics depicted on the stele and calculated that these machines, loaded with armored crew and weapons, probably weighed close to 400 kilograms. The onagers, wild asses native to the region, would need to be specially trained, bred, and maintained, requiring dedicated handlers, veterinarians, or their Bronze Age equivalent, and probably years of selective breeding to get animals temperamentally suited for the chaos of battle. This isn't ad hoc militia, this is a standing army with specialized units, supporting infrastructure, and institutional memory. The other side of the stele depicts the aftermath, and here's where it gets grimly fascinating. Vultures, the stele's namesake, circle above a field strewn with enemy corpses, pecking at naked bodies piled in heaps. Eannatum himself, portrayed at gigantic scale compared to ordinary soldiers, an artistic convention showing his divine authority, tramples enemies underfoot while Ningirsu, the city god, holds a net full of captured enemy soldiers. These aren't symbolic representations. The detail level suggests the artist was depicting actual battlefield practices. The inscription confirms it, describing in matter-of-fact language how Eannatum left 3,600 corpses of Umma soldiers on the field. Now, demographic studies of ancient Lagash suggest the city-state's total population was probably around 35,000 to 40,000 people. If you accept standard military ratios, roughly 10 to 15% of total population available for military service, that means Lagash could field maybe 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers total. So Eannatum basically annihilated Umma's entire military-aged male population in a single engagement. We're talking about a level of organized slaughter that represents total war, existential conflict between urban states that by all accounts should have been culturally and ethnically identical, both Sumerian-speaking, both worshipping the same pantheon of gods with minor variations in patron deities. But here's what troubles historians who study ancient warfare. To maintain the kind of military force depicted on this stele requires economic surplus on a scale we're not sure Lagash possessed. Professional soldiers don't farm, don't produce goods, don't contribute to the economic base. They consume resources. You need to feed them, equip them, train them, and compensate their families for their service. You need weapons manufacturers producing standardized spears, shields, helmets, and armor. You need bronzesmiths with reliable supplies of copper and tin. Tin had to be imported from distant sources, possibly as far as Afghanistan. You need leather workers, rope makers, basket weavers, and a dozen other specialized crafts, all producing military supplies. Modern military logistics experts calculate that for every combat soldier in a pre-industrial army, you need roughly 3 to 5 support personnel in rear echelon roles. If Unadam fielded an army large enough to kill 3,600 enemies, suggesting his own force numbered at least 5,000 to maintain numerical superiority in Bronze Age combat, then the entire socio-economic structure of Lagash must have been oriented toward military production and maintenance. How did they feed everyone? How did they generate the surplus to support this massive non-productive warrior class? The inscriptions on the stele provide another mystery wrapped in an answer. Unadam claims divine authority for his campaign, stating that Ningirsu appeared to him in a dream and commanded him to attack Umma to punish them for moving boundary markers and stealing water. Fair enough, rulers have always claimed divine sanction for their wars. But the detail level is strange. Unadam describes Ningirsu providing specific tactical advice, essentially dictating battle plans. He describes the god promising exact casualty figures before the battle even took place. Either this is poetic license taken to absurd extremes, or we're looking at something else, perhaps a priestly class that possessed genuine strategic military knowledge, advising the king but attributing their counsel to divine revelation to give it unquestionable authority. Some heterodox researchers have suggested that Sumerian temples functioned as a kind of institutional memory for practical knowledge, with priests maintaining records of agricultural techniques, astronomical observations, medical treatments, and yes, military tactics, accumulated over centuries but presented to each new generation of rulers as divine wisdom rather than inherited human knowledge. It's a fascinating idea, but maddeningly difficult to prove or disprove from the textual evidence that survives. There's also the matter of what happened after the battle. The stele describes Unadam forcing Umma to accept treaty terms, requiring them to swear oaths before multiple gods, setting up boundary stones, and establishing tributary obligations. This is sophisticated international relations, complete with multi-party agreements. Other city-states apparently witnessed and guaranteed the treaty, and mechanisms for enforcement. We're looking at Bronze Age diplomacy that wouldn't be out of place in Renaissance Europe. And yet, within a generation, Umma broke the treaty, attacked Lagash, and the cycle of warfare resumed. Read the later texts from Girsu and you find king after king fighting essentially the same war over the same strip of farmland, generation after generation, each claiming divine mandate, each erecting monuments to their victories, each apparently unable or unwilling to find a permanent solution. Why? Were resources truly so limited that a few thousand hectares of barley fields justified endless bloodshed? Or is there something else we're missing, some aspect of Bronze Age Sumerian psychology or ideology that made territorial competition inevitable regardless of material considerations? Stand for a moment on the plain between Girsu and Umma. You can still walk it today if you don't mind the security situation. And picture that July morning in 2460 BC when Unadam's phalanx advanced toward the enemy line. The dust rising from thousands of feet. The animals stink of the Onager teams. The clatter of spears on shields. The shouted prayers to Ningirsu for victory. And then the collision, bronze on bronze, the screaming, the dying, the 3,600 bodies left rotting under the Mesopotamian sun while vultures wheeled overhead. All that suffering, all that death, recorded in stone with bureaucratic precision by scribes who apparently saw nothing unusual about it. We look at the stele of the vultures and see barbarism, but what if the real mystery is that we're seeing something else? Warfare as a fully rationalized, institutionalized aspect of Bronze Age urban civilization, not aberrant violence but structured, organized, legally justified killing on a mass scale. Perhaps the question isn't how they could do this, but why we find it so shocking when our own civilization has, if anything, perfected the same processes on an even grander scale. Still, we don't really know why this level of military sophistication appeared when it did, why cities barely 3 centuries removed from village farming communities could organize violence with such ruthless efficiency. The steel of the vultures gives us answers, but every answer reveals deeper questions scratched into the stone. Let me show you something that shouldn't exist: a silver vase found in the ruins of Girsu, crafted around 2400 BCE, inscribed with the dedication of Entemena, another ruler of Lagash, offered to Ningirsu in the temple precinct. Now you're probably thinking, so what? Ancient kings gave valuable offerings to gods all the time. But here's the thing: the silver itself is the mystery. Isotope analysis conducted in the 1990s revealed that this silver was mined in Anatolia, roughly 1,500 kilometers to the northwest, in what is now central Turkey. The craftsmanship shows influences from the Indus Valley civilization, at least 2,000 kilometers to the east. The decorative motifs include elements that appear in Egyptian art from the same period, 2,000 kilometers to the west. We're looking at an object that represents a trade network spanning most of the known ancient world, centered on a city that occupies maybe 2 square kilometers of mud-brick buildings in the middle of the Mesopotamian plain. Think about the logistics involved. Silver doesn't just magically appear in the hands of Sumerian craftsmen. Somebody had to mine it from Anatolian deposits, smelt it, refine it, transport it across mountain ranges and through territories controlled by multiple different political entities, exchange it for goods or currency at each trading post along the way, finally deliver it to Lagash, where artisans familiar with metalworking techniques from cultures thousands of kilometers distant then shaped it into a vase whose iconography shows awareness of artistic conventions from Egypt, Iran, and the Indus region. We're talking about a Bronze Age globalization, an interconnected trading world that linked disparate civilizations into something approaching a world system, and it was centered on Mesopotamian cities like Girsu. How did this happen? How did Bronze Age merchants, traveling on foot or by donkey caravan or aboard reed boats, create trade routes spanning continents? Who financed these expeditions? What did they trade? And perhaps most intriguingly, what information traveled along these same routes? Recent excavations have revealed that Girsu wasn't just consuming exotic imports, it was a manufacturing center in its own right. Archaeologists have found workshop areas filled with evidence of textile production on an industrial scale. Loom weights, spindle whorls, and the remains of massive dyeing vats suggest Lagash was producing tens of thousands of meters of woolen cloth annually. Chemical analysis of clay tablets records showing temple inventories lists not just local products but warehoused goods from across the known world: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, probably via Egyptian intermediaries, obsidian from Anatolia, copper from Oman, tin from sources still debated, Central Asian mines? Iranian deposits? The question remains unresolved. The administrative texts are mind-boggling in their detail. Tablets listing the exact amounts of materials issued to specific workers, calculating expected production rates, recording finished goods moved from workshop to warehouse, tracking the movement of merchant caravans expected to return with foreign materials. This is command economy organization comparable to anything achieved in the ancient world. But here's where conventional economic models start breaking down. There's very limited evidence of currency in the modern sense. Most transactions seem to have been recorded in silver by weight as a unit of account, but actual physical silver was relatively rare. Instead, most day-to-day economic activity used a complex system of credit, debt, and in-kind exchange that archaeologists still struggle to fully understand. Workers received rations of barley, oil, and wool rather than payment in precious metal. Merchants apparently operated on credit extended by temple institutions or wealthy individuals, traveling to distant lands with trade goods on consignment, expected to return with valuable imports, or their equivalent value. International exchange seems to have been governed by something resembling gift exchange among elites rather than market-driven trade. So how did Entemena acquire the silver for his vase? Did he buy it? Did merchants offer it as tribute? Was it payment for exports of Lagash textiles or agricultural surplus? The tablets don't tell us, or rather they tell us too much, thousands upon thousands of administrative records that somehow never quite explain the fundamental mechanisms driving the whole system. And then there's the question of who these merchants actually were. The Sumerian language has several terms for different types of trading specialists. The Damgar, who seems to be a high-status merchant engaged in long-distance trade often on behalf of temple institutions. The Gas-8, perhaps an itinerant peddler or local trader. Various other specialized terms whose exact meanings remain frustratingly vague. Were these independent entrepreneurs? Were they temple employees? Were they something in between? We have records of Damgar merchants whose sons followed them in the same profession, suggesting families that specialized in trade across generations, accumulating knowledge of routes, languages, exchange rates, and foreign customs. Some tablets hint at merchant communities living abroad in foreign cities, serving as permanent trading posts or diaspora networks that facilitated exchange between their home cities and their adopted lands. There's tantalizing evidence of standardization of weights and measures across the region, suggesting some kind of international agreement or common practice that made trade possible between cultures using different languages and governed by different rulers. But the real mystery is this: the whole system collapsed. Around 2100 BC, Girsu declined rapidly. The trade networks that had brought silver from Anatolia and lapis from Afghanistan dried up or shifted to other centers. By 2000 BC, Girsu was a provincial backwater, and within another century or two it was largely abandoned. What happened? Climate change is one theory. There's evidence of increasing aridification across the region, putting pressure on agricultural systems. Political collapse is another. The Ur-3 dynasty that dominated southern Mesopotamia in the late 3rd millennium BC fell to Elamite invasions and internal revolt, fragmenting political unity. But here's what troubles historians: the trade networks collapse more completely than the political structures. Cities that suffer conquest typically rebuild and resume economic activity within a generation or two. But the sophisticated international exchange system visible in the silver vase of Entemena seems to have evaporated, not appearing again in comparable form for centuries. Did the knowledge of how to organize these long-distance trading ventures disappear? Did the specific families and institutions that managed trade fail to reproduce themselves? Was there some dependency on specific political conditions, peace, treaty obligations, established safe conduct practices, that couldn't be reconstructed after the collapse? Imagine yourself as one of those Bronze Age merchants, setting out from Girsu with a donkey train loaded with bales of finely woven wool, heading north and east toward the Iranian plateau, hoping to exchange your goods for lapis lazuli or tin. You carry letters of introduction from your city's ruler, sealed tablets guaranteeing your status and requesting cooperation from foreign officials. You know trading posts and caravanserais spaced along your route where you can find food, water, and protection. You speak at least rudimentary phrases in several languages. You know the exchange rates, understand how to assess quality of foreign goods, can recognize when someone is trying to cheat you. This is your family's trade, knowledge passed from father to son, routes and contacts and practices your grandfather taught your father who taught you. And then one day, for reasons you don't fully understand, the cities you visit aren't interested in your wool anymore. The political authorities who used to guarantee safe passage are gone, replaced by warlords who demand ruinous tolls. The caravanserais where you used to stay are abandoned ruins. The whole system unravels, and within a generation, nobody attempts the journey anymore because the risks exceed any possible profit. The knowledge survives in family memories for a while, old men telling stories of distant cities they visited in their youth. But gradually even the memories fade. That's what seems to have happened to the trading networks that produced the silver vase of Entemena. The knowledge of how to maintain them, fragile and dependent on specific institutions and practices, simply evaporated. We're left holding a silver vase in a museum, marveling at the skill of its creation, the purity of its metal, the elegance of its inscription, and asking questions that the artifact itself cannot answer. How did Bronze Age Girsu sit at the center of a world system, and why did that center not hold? Now we come to one of the most fascinating and mundane discoveries at Girsu, the tablet house, the Eba in Sumerian, literally, house of tablets, what we might call a school. Excavations in the residential quarter of the city uncovered what appears to be an educational facility where young scribes learn their craft, and the picture that emerges is startling in its familiarity and its strangeness. The building itself was unremarkable, a courtyard house with several rooms, clay benches along the walls where students presumably sat, and thousands upon thousands of practice tablets, the ancient equivalent of scratch paper, showing students learning the cuneiform writing system through endless repetition. Some tablets are perfect, signs carved with confidence and precision. Others are disasters, wobbly lines and malformed characters, the work of beginners struggling with the reed stylus. What makes this extraordinary is that we're looking at the world's first evidence of formalized mass education, a system designed to produce literacy not just in kings and priests but in a wider class of professional scribes, administrators, and literati who formed the bureaucratic backbone of Sumerian civilization. The curriculum visible in these practice tablets is sophisticated. Students began with basic sign lists, learning the several hundred most common cuneiform characters through rote memorization. They progressed to syllabaries, learning how signs could represent both logograms, symbols standing for entire words, and phonetic values, symbols representing sounds that could be combined into words. Advanced students copied literary texts, mythological narratives, royal hymns, proverbs, and wisdom literature. Some tablets show mathematical exercises, students working through problems involving area calculation, volume measurement, and practical arithmetic needed for accounting and administration. Others show legal formulae, practicing the standard language used to record contracts, lawsuits, and property transfers. We're looking at an education system designed to produce not just technical literacy but cultural sophistication, students who could not only read and write but who also internalized the literary and intellectual traditions of Sumerian civilization. But here's the mystery embedded in this seemingly mundane discovery. The tablet house at Girsu dates to around 2100 BC, but the educational system visible in these tablets appears fully developed, showing no signs of being newly invented. The literary texts students copied include compositions that linguistic analysis suggests are considerably older than the tablets themselves, perhaps dating back to 2400 BC or even earlier, transmitted across generations of scribes. Some of the mathematical problems show knowledge of advanced concepts, including what mathematicians recognize as early forms of algebraic thinking, that shouldn't appear for centuries according to standard histories of mathematics. And here's the real puzzle. We have no idea how many people in Girsu were literate. Some estimates suggest maybe 1 to 3% of the population could read and write, which in a city of 40,000 means perhaps 400 to 1,200 literate individuals. That's enough to create a distinct literate class, a social stratum defined by educational achievement rather than birth or wealth, though wealth certainly helped, as scribal education required families who could afford to support a child through years of training rather than putting them to work in fields or workshops. The tablet house reveals something else unsettling. Education was apparently brutal. Several literary texts describe, in deliberately humorous terms that nonetheless probably reflect real practices, students being beaten for poor performance, for talking in class, for skipping lessons. One text has a student complaining to his father that his teacher beat him multiple times in a single day for various infractions, prompting the father to invite the teacher to dinner, ply him with gifts, and essentially bribe him to treat the son better. These aren't historical records, exactly, they're literature, morality tales or satires, but they reveal an educational culture that sounds more like military training than modern schooling. Students memorize thousands of cuneiform signs, practice writing for hours daily, study texts whose archaic language they probably didn't fully understand, all to master a writing system that was deliberately kept complex and difficult, ensuring that literacy remained the exclusive province of a trained elite. Why make it so hard? Practical necessity is one answer. Cuneiform really is complex, and reading it fluently requires extensive training. But cultural preservation might be another. By making literacy difficult to acquire, Sumerian scribes ensured their own social value and professional security, while also controlling who had access to knowledge. Now think about what this means for knowledge transmission. Everything we know about Sumerian civilization, its history, literature, religion, science, administration, comes from texts written by this tiny literate elite, educated in tablet houses like the one at Girsu, trained from childhood to think and write in specific ways, to value certain kinds of knowledge and ignore or suppress others. We're not seeing ancient Mesopotamian civilization, we're seeing it through the very specific lens of scribal culture, a professional class with its own biases, interests, and blind spots. The vast majority of people in Girsu, the farmers, artisans, laborers, women, slaves, are essentially invisible in the written record except when their labor is being tallied in administrative texts or their disputes appear in legal records. Their stories, their knowledge, their ways of understanding the world died with them, leaving no trace except what professional scribes deemed worth recording. So when we talk about what the Sumerians knew or believed, we're really talking about what elite male scribes, trained in conservative educational institutions that value tradition and textual authority, chose to write down. How much are we missing? What percentage of Sumerian knowledge was transmitted orally, through apprenticeship and demonstration, through women's networks and family traditions, through practices that literate scribes never bothered to document because they seemed obvious or mundane, or outside the scope of written knowledge? There's also the tantalizing question of who could become a scribe. Most scholars assume scribal education was limited to elite families, sons of priests and administrators following their fathers into literate professions. But some tablets hint at social mobility through education, poor boys with talent and determination managing to acquire literacy, and thereby elevating themselves into professional classes. One literary text describes a student whose father is a craftsman, not obviously elite, yet who aspires to scribal status. Did Sumerian civilization have something resembling meritocratic selection through education? Or are these texts idealizing fiction, describing social mobility that was theoretically possible but practically rare? We don't know, and the tablet house evidence doesn't resolve the question. We can see the curriculum, we can see the practice tablets, but we can't see who those students were, which families sent sons to scribal training, how selection worked, what percentage of those who began training actually completed it and found professional employment as scribes. And then there's the collapse question again. The tablet house at Girsu stops producing evidence around 2000 BC. The practice tablets disappear from the archaeological record. Does this mean formal education ceased? Did the institution of the EWA collapse along with the broader political and economic systems? Literacy didn't disappear from Mesopotamia. Quite the opposite, it eventually spread more widely than ever. But something about the specific scribal culture visible at Girsu seems to have ended. Perhaps the professional scribal class lost its monopoly on literacy as writing became more practical, less tied to elite institutions. Perhaps economic changes made full-time scribal education unaffordable for most families. Perhaps the literary tradition these students were learning, Sumerian language text in a language that was already dying, replaced by Akkadian as the spoken language of Mesopotamia, seemed increasingly irrelevant. Imagine being a father in Girsu around 2000 BC, deciding whether to send your son to scribal school. You remember your grandfather telling stories of the tablet house, of the great scribes who served kings and managed temple estates, of the prestige and security that literacy once provided. But now the political situation is chaos, the temples are poor, administrative positions are fewer, and young men with scribal training are driving plows because there aren't enough bureaucratic jobs for all of them. Do you spend the family's limited resources on years of education that might not lead anywhere? Or do you teach your son a practical craft that will definitely feed his family? That calculation, made by hundreds of families over several generations, might explain the silence in the archaeological record, the sudden absence of practice tablets. The institution didn't collapse in a single catastrophic event, it just gradually stopped maturing, and parents stopped sending their children, and the knowledge preserved in the tablet house was lost, one generation at a time. Let's talk about something that should not exist: the port facility of Girsu, a complex of docks, warehouses, and canals serving a city located more than 60 kilometers from the nearest navigable river and even farther from the Persian Gulf. Modern excavations using satellite imagery and ground surveys have revealed a hydraulic infrastructure so sophisticated that civil engineers examining the evidence struggle to explain how Bronze Age builders achieved it. We're looking at a canal system that connected Girsu to the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, maintained navigable water depth through seasonal fluctuations, controlled siltation through engineering solutions we're still working to understand, and facilitated enough commercial traffic to support a major urban center. The scale is staggering. The main canal linking Girsu to the Euphrates ran approximately 15 kilometers, with a cross-section suggesting it was at least 20 meters wide and 3 meters deep at its center, representing the excavation of something like 900,000 cubic meters of earth. That's not including the network of secondary canals that distributed water through the city and surrounding agricultural fields. Cuneiform texts from Girsu refer repeatedly to canal maintenance as a primary royal duty. Kings boast in their inscriptions about digging new canals, dredging old ones, repairing breaches, and ensuring water flow. It's mentioned more often than military victories or temple construction. One ruler claims to have mobilized tens of thousands of workers for a single canal project, labor drafts that must have disrupted agricultural production and placed enormous strain on the city's resources. Modern calculations suggest that maintaining Girsu's canal network in working order required mobilizing perhaps 5 to 10% of the entire labor force for several months each year during the dry season when water levels dropped and canals filled with silt. That's an enormous ongoing expense, a permanent drain on social resources, which suggests that the economic benefits of canal transport must have been absolutely critical to the city's survival. But here's the question: why build a major urban center in a location that required such massive hydraulic infrastructure to make viable? Why not simply locate cities directly on rivers where natural waterways provided transport without the need for artificial canals? The answer probably lies in agricultural productivity and defensive considerations. The land around Girsu, when properly irrigated, was extraordinarily fertile, capable of producing barley yields that some agricultural historians estimate at 3,000 to 4,000 kilograms per hectare, far exceeding what rain-fed agriculture could achieve. The canals that served commerce also served irrigation, the same infrastructure supporting both transport and food production. And the location, slightly removed from major rivers, might have provided defensive advantages. Enemies couldn't simply sail up to your walls on river vessels. They'd have to enter your controlled canal system, potentially exposing themselves to ambush or having their supply lines cut. But the engineering required to make this work is remarkable. The canals had to maintain very precise gradients. Too steep and the water flow would erode the earthen banks. Too shallow and silt would accumulate, choking the channel. Modern studies of ancient Mesopotamian canal systems show that builders somehow achieved gradients of roughly 10 to 20 centimeters per kilometer, precise enough to maintain flow without erosion. How did they survey this over distances of 15 kilometers or more? They didn't have laser levels or surveying equipment. Did they use water levels and simple observational techniques? Did they possess inherited knowledge of land gradients from previous generations of observation? We're missing some technique, some understanding that made this possible. And then there's the question of the lock systems. Now, I need to be careful here because the evidence is contested, but several archaeologists examining the Girsu Canal network believe they've identified remnants of primitive lock systems, essentially controlled weirs that could raise or lower water levels in different canal sections to facilitate boat traffic over elevation changes. If true, and that's a significant if, this would represent hydraulic engineering more advanced than anything we typically credit to the ancient world, technology we usually associate with medieval China or Renaissance Europe. The structures in question are heavily eroded, making definitive identification impossible without extensive excavation that hasn't been conducted due to security concerns in southern Iraq. But the theoretical analysis is intriguing. If you're moving boat traffic between canals at different elevations, you need some mechanism to handle the elevation change. Simply connecting high and low canals produces turbulent flow that makes navigation dangerous and accelerates erosion. Some kind of controlled chamber where boats could be raised or lowered would solve the problem elegantly. Did Sumerian engineers invent something like this? We genuinely don't know, but the physical geography of the canal network suggests they had to solve the problem somehow. The archaeological evidence from the port district includes massive storage facilities, multi-room warehouse complexes built with unusually thick walls and sophisticated drainage systems, clearly designed to protect stored goods from moisture, pests, and theft. Clay seals found in these warehouses record the names of merchants, the types of goods stored, and sometimes their origins: bales of wool from the temple estates, jars of date syrup from regional plantations, copper ingots from Magan, imported woods from Lebanon, stored in secure facilities managed by what appears to be professional warehouse administrators. This is supply chain management, inventory control, and commercial organization that looks remarkably modern in its basic logic, even though the technological implementations were entirely different. Some scholars analyzing these systems have suggested that Sumerian temple and palace institutions essentially invented corporate organization, creating impersonal administrative structures that survived beyond any individual's lifetime, maintaining continuity through written records and bureaucratic procedures. Whether that's accurate or overstated, there's no question that the economic organization visible in Girsu's port district represents sophisticated institutional development. But the canals didn't last. Sometime around 2000 BC, perhaps earlier, the main canal linking Girsu to the Euphrates apparently began failing. Siltation overwhelmed maintenance efforts. Sections collapsed and weren't repaired. The port facilities fell into disuse. Trade shifted to other centers better located or better able to maintain their infrastructure. Modern geomorphological studies suggest that broader environmental changes might have played a role. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers are naturally unstable, shifting their courses over time as sediment accumulates and new channels open. If the river course changed even a few kilometers, the entire canal network linking Girsu to that river might require extensive re-engineering to maintain connectivity. Did Girsu simply lack the resources for such a massive reconstruction project at a time when the political situation was already unstable? The texts hint at crisis but don't clearly explain what happened. One late inscription mentions canal banks broken, trade disrupted, merchants crying out for royal intervention, but whether this describes catastrophic failure or routine problems exaggerated for dramatic effect is unclear. Picture a merchant vessel approaching Girsu's port around 2300 BC, sails furled, poles deployed to push the heavy hull through the canal's sluggish current. The captain watches the depth carefully, knowing that in this section the channel narrows and sandbars lurk just below the surface. Warehouse workers on the dock prepare to unload his cargo: copper ingots destined for the temple workshops, cedar beams for construction, luxury goods for elite consumption. Tax assessors stand ready to calculate duties owed on the shipment. This is a routine transaction, one of dozens happening daily, part of a commercial network that makes Girsu wealthy and powerful. Now jump forward 2 centuries. The same canal is choked with silt, barely navigable, more ditch than waterway. The docks are abandoned, walls crumbling. A few desperate merchants still attempt the journey, but most traffic goes elsewhere, to cities better positioned, better maintained, better connected to the changing hydrology of Mesopotamia. What knowledge died in that transition? The techniques for building and maintaining canals surely survived in some form. Irrigation remained critical throughout Mesopotamian history, but the specific expertise required to manage the vast commercial canal networks, the institutional knowledge embedded in generations of harbor masters and canal supervisors and hydraulic engineers, that seems to have been lost, or at least never replicated on the same scale. We're left with silt-filled depressions in the desert landscape, visible from satellite but meaningless from the ground, and a handful of texts complaining about canal failure, and archaeological remains of dock facilities that once buzzed with commercial activity. The engineering remains impressive, the collapse remains unexplained. Now let's examine something small but profoundly puzzling: the cylinder seals of Girsu, tiny carved stones, usually less than 5 centimeters tall and 2 centimeters in diameter, incised with intricate designs and texts that reveal both remarkable craftsmanship and enduring mysteries. These seals functioned as signatures in Mesopotamian society. Roll the seal across damp clay and it leaves a unique impression that authenticates documents, marks ownership, or serves as a kind of ancient ID card. Thousands have been found at Girsu, ranging from crude examples that look like amateur work to absolute masterpieces of miniature sculpture that modern gem cutters struggle to replicate even with diamond-tipped tools and magnification. The best examples pack extraordinary detail into minuscule space: divine figures with individually carved feathers on their wings, human faces with distinct expressions, architectural elements showing building plans, hunting scenes with animals in mid-leap, mythological narratives depicting gods and monsters engaged in cosmic struggles. And all of this carved into hard stones: hematite, serpentine, lapis lazuli, carnelian, using Bronze Age tools that should not have been capable of achieving such precision. The iconography on these seals is where things get interesting. Many depict Ningirsu in his role as divine warrior, often shown in combat with an adversary or holding a captive enemy. Some show Ningirsu receiving offerings from smaller human figures, presumably representing the seal owner asserting their pious relationship with the city god. But others show mythological scenes that don't match any surviving textual traditions, unidentified gods engaged in actions we can't interpret, hybrid creatures that don't appear in any known myths, celestial symbols whose meanings remain opaque. Akkadian scholars working with cuneiform texts have identified most major Sumerian deities and their attributes, but some seal designs depict divine figures we simply cannot name. Are these local gods worshipped in Girsu but not documented in surviving literature? Are they artistic variations on known deities, changing iconographic details in ways that confuse modern interpreters? Or are they evidence of religious beliefs and practices that never got written down, oral traditions and local cults that existed alongside the official state religion but left no textual trace? There's also the question of who owned these seals and what their ownership signified. The most elaborate examples must have been expensive, commissioned from master craftsmen by wealthy elites. Administrative texts mention seal cutters as specialized professionals, and some seals bear inscriptions identifying their owners by name, title, and family affiliation. But many seals found at Girsu have no inscription, just imagery, making it impossible to identify their owners or understand their specific function. Were these personal seals used by illiterate individuals who couldn't commission inscribed versions? Were they purely decorative amulets with no administrative function? Somewhere patterns suggest heavy use, the carved surfaces polished smooth from thousands of impressions into clay, while others show minimal wear, as if they were rarely used or perhaps served primarily as jewelry or status symbols. The presence of children's seals, miniature versions clearly sized for small hands, suggests seal ownership was socially significant enough that even children needed them, though whether this reflects aristocratic customs or something more widespread remains uncertain. Modern attempts to replicate the finest Girsu seals using period-appropriate technology have been largely unsuccessful. Experimental archaeologists working with copper and bronze tools, even using abrasive techniques with sand and emery, report that achieving the fine detail visible on masterpiece examples requires hundreds of hours of work and extraordinary manual dexterity. The economic implications are significant. If a master seal cutter working full-time could produce perhaps 4 to 6 fine seals per year, and if Girsu's elite population numbered in the hundreds or low thousands, the demand for quality seals might have supported multiple workshops employing dozens of specialized craftsmen. This is elite art, but also craft industry, luxury production operating at a scale suggesting significant disposable wealth concentrated in the hands of Girsu's upper classes. Where did that wealth come from? Agricultural surplus is the obvious answer. Productive irrigation-fed barley fields generated food beyond subsistence needs. allowing some portion of the population to engage in non-productive specialized labor. But the text suggests taxation was heavy and social inequality stark, with temple and palace institutions controlling large shares of the land while many ordinary farmers worked as dependent laborers, tenant farmers owing huge portions of their harvest as rent or tax. The beautiful cylinder seals, in other words, might represent the crystallized surplus extracted from thousands of subsistence farmers, transformed into miniature art objects that expressed elite status and divine connection. And then there are the seals whose imagery suggests knowledge we wouldn't expect. Several examples from Girsu depict what look like accurate astronomical observations, constellations represented with positions that match actual star patterns visible in the Mesopotamian sky, though identifying which constellations the Sumerians intended is complicated by the fact that they divided the heavens differently than later Babylonian or Greek astronomers. Some seals show what appear to be eclipse events, darkened celestial bodies surrounded by corona-like patterns that recall descriptions of solar eclipses. Did seal owners commission designs commemorating important astronomical events they witnessed? Were there professional astronomers in Girsu making systematic observations, and did seal iconography incorporate their discoveries? We know later Babylonian astronomers achieved remarkable precision in tracking celestial movements, predicting eclipses and planetary positions with math that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. But the Girsu seals push evidence of astronomical knowledge back several centuries earlier than we usually credit it, to a time when we're not sure such systematic observation was occurring. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe we're overinterpreting accidental resemblances between decorative designs and actual sky phenomena. Or maybe Bronze Age Sumerians were watching the heavens more carefully than we realize, accumulating observations that eventually crystallized into the sophisticated astronomy visible in later cuneiform texts. Hold one of these seals in your hand. You can see examples in any major museum with Mesopotamian collections, and feel the weight of the tiny stone, the smooth surface worn by ancient fingers. Roll it across clay and watch the image appear, perfectly formed, thousands of years after the craftsman who carved it turned to dust. The seal is both intimate, made to fit a specific person's hand, and eternal, surviving its owner, its maker, its civilization. What did the person who wore the seal think when they pressed it into clay? Did they see it as just a utilitarian tool, like we might view a signature stamp? Or did the images carry deeper meaning, personal connection to the gods depicted, family heritage embedded in the design, social aspiration expressed in miniature sculpture? We can catalog the seals, photograph them, analyze their iconography, but the lived experience of cylinder seal ownership in ancient Girsu remains inaccessible, a mystery we can touch but never quite grasp. Now we enter the darkest and most controversial discovery associated with Girsu and the Lagash kingdom, the so-called Great Death Pit. Discovered during excavations in the early 20th century, a tomb complex that defies easy explanation and challenges our assumptions about Bronze Age religion, social structure, and the value placed on human life. Let me be clear, most of the famous royal tombs that show evidence of mass human sacrifice are from Girsu's neighbor and sometimes rival, not from Girsu itself. But Girsu's text describes similar practices, and smaller burial complexes discovered at the site show unmistakable evidence of retainer sacrifice, attendants killed to accompany their masters or mistresses into the afterlife. The scale visible at is what grabs attention. Tombs containing dozens of sacrificed individuals, apparently going willingly to their deaths, dressed in elaborate regalia, positioned in careful arrangements around the primary burial. But the practice appears to have been widespread across Sumerian city-states during the early dynastic period, roughly 2600 to 2350 BC, before apparently ceasing or becoming much less common in later eras. The archaeological evidence from Ur's death pits, and similar though smaller examples from Girsu, suggests that these weren't executions in the conventional sense. The bodies show no signs of violent trauma. They appear to have been carefully arranged, lying in ordered rows, wearing jewelry and fine clothes, holding musical instruments or ritual objects. The leading theory is that victims consumed poison voluntarily, perhaps in a ritualized ceremony accompanied by music and solemn pageantry, descending into the tomb chamber alive, taking their fatal dose, and then being sealed in as they died or fell unconscious. Imagine participating in such an event. You know you're going to die, that you've been selected for this dubious honor, and yet you dress in your finest clothes, don elaborate headdresses made of gold and carnelian, take your place in the tomb chamber, drink or eat whatever substance will end your life, and wait for darkness. What would induce someone to do this? Religious conviction is the obvious answer. If you genuinely believe that your death serves the gods, that you'll continue serving your master or mistress in the afterlife, that your sacrifice ensures proper transition between worlds, then perhaps voluntary death becomes comprehensible as an act of devotion. But modern scholars are deeply uncomfortable with this explanation because it smacks of rationalizing what looks like straightforward murder, using religion as excuse for human sacrifice that served primarily to display elite power and complete control over subordinates' lives and deaths. Alternative theories abound. Maybe these weren't voluntary sacrifices but coerced deaths, victims drugged or forced into compliance through psychological manipulation or outright violence that left no skeletal marks. Maybe the elaborate jewelry and positioning was post-mortem staging, bodies arranged to create impressive spectacle regardless of how the individuals actually died. Maybe these tombs represent only royal or priestly burials, exceptional events not representative of normal religious practice, moments of dynastic transition or cosmic significance when normal rules were suspended. Some heterodox researchers have suggested that the death pits might represent plague burials, mass deaths from epidemic disease that were ritualized after the fact to make sense of catastrophe, though this doesn't explain the careful arrangement and rich grave goods. Others have proposed that we're seeing the aftermath of succession conflicts, losing factions in civil wars being executed and buried together as posthumous humiliation, though again the archaeological evidence doesn't obviously support this. The honest answer is we don't know. We have the physical evidence, bodies, arranged in tombs, accompanied by extraordinary wealth, killed by unknown means, and we have exactly zero eyewitness accounts, zero detailed descriptions of the ceremonies that produced these deposits, zero surviving texts that explain what anyone involved was thinking. The Girsu texts that hint at retainer sacrifice or post-mortem offerings are frustratingly vague. Some royal inscriptions mention servants who followed a dead ruler, phrasing that could mean ceremonial retainers included in the tomb or could mean literal human sacrifice. Hymns and lamentations sometimes reference the dead needing provisions and attendance in the afterlife, but it's unclear if this is metaphorical language or describing actual practice. Administrative texts record enormous quantities of food, drink, textiles, and precious goods dedicated to royal funerals, suggesting lavish ceremonies, but they don't explicitly mention killing people. So we're left in this uncomfortable position of having strong archaeological evidence for a practice, mass human sacrifice accompanying elite burials, that the textual record barely acknowledges. Why the silence? Were such sacrifices so routine they didn't need explicit documentation? Were they religiously sensitive, restricted knowledge not suitable for written records that might be read by unauthorized persons? Or is our textual corpus simply inadequate, chance preservation of documents that didn't happen to address funerary practices in detail? Each possibility is unsettling in its own way. And then the practice stops, or at least becomes archaeologically invisible, sometime around 2350 BC. The tombs from later periods don't show evidence of mass sacrifice. Akkadian and UR3 royal burials include rich grave goods but not dozens of sacrificed attendants. Something changed, either in religious belief, or in social organization, or in the degree of power rulers could exercise over their subjects. What changed? Did evolving theology reject human sacrifice as improper or unnecessary? Did social changes make it harder for elites to command such ultimate obedience? Did economic constraints make it wasteful to kill dozens of skilled workers who could be producing value for the state? Or did the practice continue but shift to forms that don't leave archaeological signatures? Perhaps fewer victims, cremation rather than burial, sacrifice performed at temples rather than in tombs? We're guessing based on absence of evidence, which is always dangerous. Stand at the edge of one of those excavated death pits and look down into the void. The bodies are long gone, removed to museums, but the empty space remains, a cavity in the earth that once held human beings who died for reasons we can't fully fathom. Maybe they believed they were ensuring cosmic order, maintaining the connection between earthly and divine realms, serving their masters or mistresses beyond death. Maybe they were terrified victims, drugged into compliance, unable to resist the power arrayed against them. Maybe truth lies somewhere between. People socialized from birth to accept that service to elites extended even unto death, who experienced their sacrifice as both obligation and honor, simultaneously coerced and willing in ways that don't map neatly onto our modern categories of choice and compulsion. The death pits of Girsu and its neighboring cities reveal something about Bronze Age Sumerian civilization that we'd perhaps prefer not to know, that societies capable of extraordinary cultural achievement, sophisticated art, complex administration, and impressive technological innovation can simultaneously practice rituals that we can only describe as human sacrifice. The cognitive dissonance this creates for modern observers. How can people who wrote beautiful poetry also casually kill servants to stuff into tombs? Might say more about our own assumptions than about ancient realities. Maybe sophistication and brutality aren't opposites, but compatible aspects of human social organization under specific conditions. Or maybe we're still missing something fundamental, some context or understanding that would make the death pits comprehensible rather than simply horrifying. Either way, the empty chambers remain, question marks carved into the earth of southern Iraq, waiting for answers we're not sure how to find. So where does all this leave us? We've walked together through the temples and workshops of Girsu, examined artifacts ranging from massive stone monuments to tiny carved seals, traced trade networks spanning continents, and hydraulic engineering projects that defy easy explanation. We've confronted mysteries in architecture, technology, social organization, belief systems, and ultimately in human nature itself. What can we conclude about this lost city of the Lagash kingdom, this Bronze Age urban center that thrived for centuries and then faded into the Iraqi desert, leaving only ruins and questions? Here's what we know for certain: Girsu was real. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming and incontrovertible. People lived here, built monumental structures, wrote thousands of documents, traded across vast distances, practiced sophisticated arts and technologies, created a civilization that was genuinely impressive by any standard. We know they possessed knowledge we've struggled to replicate, stoneworking techniques we can't fully explain, hydraulic engineering we're still analyzing, economic organization that managed complex supply chains across the ancient world. We know they were capable of both remarkable creativity and disturbing violence, that they produced beautiful art and brutal warfare, sophisticated literature and apparent human sacrifice, all within the same cultural context. And we know it all collapsed, that by 2000 BC Girsu was declining, its canals silting up, its trade networks fragmenting, its populations dispersing, its accumulated knowledge beginning the long dissolution into obscurity. But knowing these facts doesn't really explain anything. Why did Sumerian civilization develop where and when it did? The environmental conditions in southern Mesopotamia aren't obviously superior to dozens of other regions where urban civilization could have emerged but didn't. Why did writing develop here? Why the specific religious beliefs centered on anthropomorphic gods residing in temples? Why the peculiar political fragmentation into competing city-states rather than unification into larger territorial kingdoms? Why the specific technological paths Sumerians followed, sophisticated hydraulics and metallurgy but relatively simple machinery, complex mathematics but limited application to practical engineering problems, extensive astronomical observation but minimal development of predictive models? Every answer leads to more questions. And the collapse remains mysterious despite decades of scholarship. Yes, we can point to environmental stresses, aridification, salinization of agricultural soils from centuries of irrigation, possible shifts in river courses. Yes, we can note political fragmentation and military conflicts that disrupted trade and destroyed infrastructure. Yes, We can identify the Gutian invasions and Elamite conquests that ended Sumerian political independence. But many civilizations face similar stresses without collapsing as thoroughly as Sumerian civilization did. Why didn't Girsu recover? Why didn't the trading networks re-establish themselves? Why did the specific knowledge embedded in institutions like the tablet house simply evaporate rather than adapting to new conditions? The more you study the evidence, the more it seems like Sumerian civilization suffered from some kind of systemic fragility, an underlying instability that made impressive achievements unsustainable over time. But identifying that fragility, understanding its sources, explaining why this particular civilization couldn't adapt, those remain open questions. Maybe the real lesson of Girsu is about the contingency of knowledge itself. We talk about progress and development as if they're inevitable, as if accumulated knowledge naturally persists and expands. But Girsu suggests something different, that knowledge is fragile, dependent on specific institutions and practices and social conditions to maintain it, and that when those conditions change, knowledge can be lost completely within a generation or two. The Sumerian scribes who could read archaic texts, the engineers who knew how to maintain complex canal systems, the artisans who carved diorite with superhuman skill, the astronomers who tracked celestial movements, the merchants who knew routes to distant lands, all that expertise existed only in human minds and in the social structures that transmitted it from one generation to the next. When those structures faltered, the knowledge evaporated. We're left holding artifacts we can describe but not reproduce, reading texts we can translate but not fully understand, mapping structures whose purposes remain unclear. It's a humbling reminder that civilization is always one or two generations from barbarism, that everything we think we know is one catastrophe away from oblivion. But there's wonder here too, not just tragedy. Every artifact from Girsu represents human achievement, people solving problems, creating beauty, building meaning from mud and stone and metal. The silver vase of Antemina isn't just evidence of trade networks. It's evidence that Bronze Age merchants risked their lives traveling thousands of kilometers to exchange goods they'd never produced for materials they'd never seen, trusting in systems of credit and reputation that spanned cultural and linguistic boundaries. The steel of the vultures isn't just evidence of warfare, it's evidence that artists could take something as chaotic and brutal as battle and transform it into permanent commemoration, creating meaning from violence. The temple complexes aren't just engineering achievements. They're evidence that humans have always reached for the transcendent, building structures that dwarf human scale to honor forces they imagined as larger than themselves. Even the death pits, disturbing as they are, testify to the human need to make death meaningful, to refuse the idea that individuals simply end, to construct narratives and rituals that connect mortal life to eternal significance. So here's where we end, or rather where we choose not to end because the story of Girsu is still being written. French and British archaeologists continue excavating the site, revealing new complexes, finding new texts, refining our understanding. Every season brings discoveries that force revision of previous theories. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery reveal structures nobody knew existed. Chemical analyses of artifacts yield data that wasn't accessible to earlier generations of researchers. The conversation continues, the questions multiply, the mystery deepens even as our knowledge expands. That's how it should be. Girsu shouldn't be a closed case, a story with neat conclusions. It should remain open, contested, mysterious, constantly surprising us with new evidence that challenges our assumptions. Walk the ruins if you ever get the chance. The security situation permitting, the site is accessible to determined visitors, though you'll need local guides and probably armed escorts given the region's instability. Stand among the eroded mud-brick walls and try to imagine the city in its glory, thousands of people moving through crowded streets, merchants haggling in markets, priests ascending temple stairs, children playing in courtyards, artisans bent over their work, scribes recording transactions in cuneiform that will survive millennia after their bones turn to dust. That world existed. It was real. The people who built Girsu loved and feared and hoped and dreamed, struggled with problems that seemed insurmountable, achieved things that must have seemed impossible, lived lives that mattered desperately to them even though we'll never know their names. They left us these fragments: temples and tablets, seals and statues, canals and tombs, and whether we understand them correctly or not, the fragments testify to human presence, human effort, human meaning-making in the face of mortality and obscurity. Keep digging, keep questioning, keep wondering. The story of Girsu isn't finished because the human story isn't finished. We're still asking the same questions they asked: how to build societies that work, how to preserve knowledge across generations, how to find meaning in a world that ultimately reclaims everything we create. The answers they found worked for a while, then stopped working, and disappeared into the sand. The answers we're finding will likely fare no better. But the attempt matters. The effort to understand, to build, to preserve, to remember, that's what makes us human, what connects us across 4,000 years to the scribes and builders and merchants and priests of Girsu. Their city fell. Their civilization ended. Their knowledge was lost. But they were here. They built something extraordinary. And fragments of that extraordinary achievement still rise from the desert, still pose questions nobody can fully answer, still remind us that human potential is vast and human fragility is absolute, and somehow we have to hold both truths in mind simultaneously if we want to understand anything about who we were, who we are, and who we might become. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, waiting. Keep digging.